When most people think of tanks, they picture open ground, wide fields, flat terrain, long sight lines where armor can move fast and shoot far and do what it was actually built to do. Vietnam was the opposite of every single one of those things. The jungle was dense enough to block light at midday. Trees pushed against each other so tightly that a column of armor often had no choice but to follow whatever trail already existed, because cutting a new one through double and triple canopy with a 52-ton tank was slow, loud, and announced your position to anyone within a kilometer. The ground underneath those trails was soft, waterlogged for months out of the year, and more than capable of swallowing a vehicle whole. Tanks got bogged down in rice paddies, slid off narrow dikes, and sank into creek beds that looked crossable until they weren't. A tank that can't move is not a tank, it is a target. During monsoon season, roads turned into rivers and paddy fields became impassable for weeks at a time. Units were forced onto alternate paths that were slower and far more dangerous. Movement that took hours in the dry season now took days. The heat made everything worse before the shooting even started. Temperatures inside a tank in Vietnam regularly hit 50 degrees Celsius or above. That is before any fire, any smoke, any fighting. Just sitting in the vehicle with the engine running in the tropical sun was physically punishing. Crews came out of vehicles after extended operations dehydrated and exhausted in ways that accumulated and never fully cleared before the next mission. Vietnam stripped tanks of most of their conventional advantages before the enemy fired a single shot. The jungle was already against them. So, if the terrain was that hostile to armor, why were tanks there in the first place? The answer is that tanks were not in Vietnam to fight other tanks. There were no armored formations rolling toward each other across open ground. What tanks were doing was something different, and once you understand what that was, it makes sense that the military wanted them there even in jungle conditions. The primary vehicle was the M48A3 Patton, a 52-ton main battle tank mounting a 90mm gun. It was not designed for jungle warfare. Nobody was pretending it was, but a 90mm gun pointed at a tree line, a bunker complex, or a fortified village did things that infantry and helicopter gunships could not always replicate. When American infantry was pinned down and taking fire from a prepared position, a tank could roll up and put rounds directly into it. That was not a small thing. That kind of direct fire support right up close was something no other asset in the theater could consistently provide on short notice. Convoy escort was another core mission. Roads between bases and supply points were constant ambush ground, and a tank at the front or rear of a supply convoy changed the math for anyone considering hitting it. It did not eliminate ambushes, but it meant that whoever was planning one had to account for a vehicle that machine gun fire and small arms could not stop. The M113 armored personnel carrier, particularly in its ACAV configuration with added gun shields and extra machine guns, moved with infantry and cavalry units through terrain where the M48 sometimes could not go. Together, these vehicles gave American forces mobile protected firepower that nothing else could provide in that environment. Tanks were there because infantry needed them. Even in the worst possible country for armor, that did not change. Roads in Vietnam were not safe transit routes. They were pre-targeted kill zones that the enemy had often prepared long before any American column ever used them. The most constant threat was mines. The NVA and Viet Cong used anti-tank mines in enormous numbers, and many of them were not manufactured weapons at all. They were improvised from dud American bombs, artillery shells, and whatever explosive material could be recovered, packed into containers and buried under road surfaces where tank tracks would compress them. A full anti-tank mine detonating under a 52-ton vehicle did not always destroy it outright, but it could blow off a track, rupture the hull floor, kill or wound everyone in the crew, and leave the tank immobile in the middle of a road where it became an instant target. And once a lead vehicle was immobility killed and sitting sideways across a narrow jungle track, nothing behind it was going anywhere either. Command-detonated explosives made the mine problem worse. These were not pressure-triggered weapons. They were wired to a firing position where someone was watching and waiting to detonate them at the exact right moment, usually when the most valuable vehicle in a column was directly above them. Crews knew that the road surface in front of them might look completely normal and still be lethal. There was no reliable way to visually detect a well-placed command-detonated device from a moving vehicle. Engineers swept roads regularly. That helped. It did not solve it. Ambushes on roads followed a pattern the NVA used consistently and effectively. The lead vehicle got hit first, to stop the column. The rear vehicle got hit next, to box it in. Then fire came from both sides of the road simultaneously. RPGs targeted the tanks because the crews knew that killing a tank visually and audibly collapsed the morale of everyone around it. Recoilless rifles fired from tree lines at ranges where the crew inside the tank might not even identify where the shot came from before the second one was already in the air. Infantry riding on the outside of tanks, which was common because it allowed faster movement with better observation, became catastrophically exposed the moment an ambush opened. There was no good position. Inside the vehicle, you were protected but blind and sealed in. Outside, you could see, but you were in the open when the shooting started. Some roads got hit so regularly that crews on certain convoy routes knew by reputation which stretches were the ones to watch. That knowledge did not make those stretches safe. It just meant the tension started earlier. The armor protected the crew. That part was real. Rifle fire, shrapnel from most artillery, and light automatic weapons were not getting through an M48's hull. But protection and safety are not the same thing, and what it was actually like to be inside that vehicle through days and weeks of operations in Vietnam was a different story. The commander's position was particularly exposed. To see properly, to direct the driver, to identify targets and threats, tank commanders in Vietnam frequently operated with their head out of the hatch. There was no version of this that was safe. Snipers targeted them. Fragmentation from nearby explosions reached them. RPG teams that could not penetrate the hull armor still sent blast and fragments across the top of the vehicle where the commander was standing. Many tank commanders in Vietnam were killed or wounded by threats that never touched the tank itself. When a tank was hit and penetrated, or when a track was blown off by a mine and the vehicle was stuck in place, the dynamic inside changed immediately. A stopped tank in jungle terrain was surrounded on all sides by cover and concealment that it could not fully suppress. Fire coming from multiple directions while the crew was trying to assess damage, treat wounded, and either restore mobility or make a decision to abandon the vehicle was one of the most dangerous situations armor crews faced. Abandoning the vehicle in the open invited fire from anyone watching. Staying in a burning tank was the other option. The M48 had fuel and ammunition on board. A penetrating hit or a fire that reached either of those created consequences that went beyond the initial damage. Crews knew this. It was part of what they carried with them every time the hatch closed. One of the defining features of fighting in Vietnam for tank crews was that the enemy was almost never where you could clearly see them. Bunker systems in Vietnam were engineered seriously, not improvised holes. Proper reinforced fighting positions connected by tunnel networks, built low and covered in vegetation, sometimes invisible from 5 meters away. RPG teams could fire from inside tree lines, from behind berms, from spider holes barely larger than the shooter. The muzzle flash was gone before the round arrived. The shooter was already moving before the crew could orient a weapon toward where the shot came from. And in jungle terrain, moving 10 meters in the right direction put a man completely out of sight. Firing into jungle was a standard response to taking fire from a tree line. The tank's 90mm gun, coaxial machine gun, and the commander's .50 caliber could put enormous volumes of fire into a tree line in seconds. Whether that fire was hitting anyone, whether the threat was still in that location, or whether the fire team that launched the RPG had already moved to a secondary position through a tunnel or a covered route, the crew often had no way to know. The jungle absorbed it and gave nothing back. This created a specific psychological pressure that ground down crews over time. You could not confirm kills the way ground infantry sometimes could. You could not always tell if you had neutralized the threat or simply silenced it temporarily. Moving into a tree line after engaging it meant potentially driving into a prepared secondary position, a waiting ambush, or a minefield placed exactly where the tank would go after clearing the obvious firing line. At night, the problem became more extreme. The jungle went dark in ways that made observation nearly impossible without thermal optics that most crews did not have. Sounds carried, but direction was hard to judge through dense vegetation. Crews on night defensive positions held their perimeter and waited, knowing that the jungle surrounding them contained threats they could not currently see, and that some of those threats were specifically trained to move through it silently. The invisibility of the enemy was not a failure of the crews to look hard enough. It was a deliberate and practiced feature of how their opponents fought, and it worked. With everything stacked against armor in Vietnam, the obvious question is why tanks kept operating at all, and the answer is straightforward. Infantry needed them. When an American rifle platoon hit a prepared bunker line in the jungle with no armor support, clearing it meant putting men directly into the fire. When a tank could be brought up, it changed the engagement completely. A 90mm round fired directly into a bunker aperture at close range did what no other available weapon could replicate quickly and reliably. reliably. Infantry commanders who had worked with armor knew what that meant in practice, and they asked for it whenever they could get it. On firebase perimeter defense, tanks parked in fighting positions provided direct fire capability that could stop a ground assault in ways that nothing else in the firebase could match. During the major NVA conventional offensives of 1968 and later years, bases that had armor in their perimeter held under attacks that might otherwise have overrun them. The psychological effect on the enemy was real and documented. NVA forces that had been fighting infantry without armor reacted differently when tanks appeared. Not always. The NVA were disciplined and adapted quickly, but the presence of a tank moving through a position, the noise and the firepower and the sheer physical mass of it, changed the equation in ways that were hard to quantify and impossible to ignore. The men who crewed those vehicles kept rolling forward because the people alongside them needed them to, not because the environment had become less hostile or the mines had stopped or the ambushes had slowed down. The jungle stayed the same, the danger stayed the same, the job still needed doing, and they were the ones doing it.